In this video, what I want to do is go over motion blur. There's some important caveats that you have to follow with motion blur, and you have to adhere to in order to get it to work correctly and as expected. So I strongly recommend using motion blur with your Lagoa fluid sims. I think it looks great, more realistic, and much more polished. Okay, so when working with motion blur, one thing that you noticed in previous video where I cached the polygonized mesh, I went to the advanced tab and I turned on this motion blur parameter, basically telling the system to calculate 3D motion vectors, okay, which is very important. So let me play back the simulation here. And the fluid's coming down. Let me just zoom in here a little bit, and I'm going to render this out right here. Okay, so you can see the fluid. Well, we can also see the particles right there. Very important. Let me take the actual point cloud here. I'm going to go to its visibility settings and turn off render visibility. I only want the fluid to render out, not the particles themselves. Okay, so right now we don't have any motion blur turned on. Alright, so let me go over to the render menu up here. I'm going to go to regions, go to all options, and I'm going to turn on the enable motion blur parameter. And you're going to notice that I get a little bit of motion blur right there. It's a little bit subtle right there, but let me show you over here. If I turn off the calculate 3D motion vectors, I get no motion blur. So if you look at that, it looks very sharp. When I turn this back on, I get my nice motion blur. Okay, something that's really interesting as well. You can turn on this scale when reading cache files parameter, because I've cached the files out, and I could take this scale parameter, and if I want to reduce the motion blur, I can drop this down and I get less motion blur. If I increase it, I get a lot more motion blur. You can see that. So just to show you a comparison, here's a render region with standard motion blur, a scale of 1. I'm going to save that out. And I'm going to increase it to a scale of 2. And this is the before. This is the after. So you can see there's a lot more motion blur with that one. Let me set this back to a scale of 1. So always when you cache this stuff out, make sure you have the calculate 3D motion vector parameter turned on, okay? And then you can turn on the reading cache file parameter down here, and then you can use the scale to go back and forth. So you don't have to re-simulate the fluid simulation again. You could just use this as a quick solution for adjusting your motion blur on the polygonized mesh without having to, recalculate anything. So it's a pretty fast, quick, and efficient way of working. Alright, so with that said, we've got motion blur working. However, there's one really important thing that I want to point out. Our motion blur right now is actually incorrect. That's right. I said our motion blur is incorrect. This parameter here for calculating the motion vectors of the polygonized mesh works good when you have a polygonized mesh that hasn't been deformed again. And what I mean by deformed again is if you added something like, say, for example, the Lagoa fluid shaper to the polygonized mesh. So let's have a look at that. If I select the polygonized mesh and I refresh its ice tree, let me move this over here. You notice that it has the Lagoa fluid shaper. Now, this is going to deform the mesh, okay? And what that's going to do, it's going to cause the motion vectors to actually be incorrect. So in order to correct this little problem here, what we need to do is select the polygonizer, okay? And we need to go to the deform menu. Let's go to the create menu. And here's Lagoa fluid shaper. What we want to do is we want to apply a subframe deformation to this. So let's click on subframe deformation. It's going to ask us to select a point cloud, okay? We need to select this cached point cloud from before. So I'm going to select that. And what's going to happen is if we look in our ice tree, a new ice tree was created for our polygonized mesh, and this PPG popped up. Let me close that. This is really important. This compound here, the subframe deformation, is going to return the correct motion blur for our fluid simulation. Now, the first motion blur we used from the polygonized mesh over here, the calculate 3D motion vectors, actually looks pretty good. Okay, but if you want to be more accurate and have correct motion blur, what you want to do is you want to turn this off, because now what we're going to do is we're going to use the subframe deformation to calculate the motion blur. Okay, so if we have the polygonizer calculating motion blur, and we have the subframe deformation calculating motion blur, what we're going to have is A, incorrect results, and B, we're calculating something twice, which is going to make us take a longer time to render. So I'm going to turn off the motion vectors parameter in the Polygonizer PPG, and for the subframe deformation, I'm going to leave this. I'm going to have this take care of motion blur. So let's go ahead and render this out again, and you can see we have some motion blur. Now, if I want to control the amount of motion blur, the way I can do this is I can use the PPG over here for the subframe deformation. And there's a few parameters here you can play around with, but the main parameter is the factor. If I reduce the factor from 1 to say 0.5, I get much less motion blur. If I increase it by a lot, I get a lot of motion blur. You could see that there's a ton of motion blur to the point where we can barely make out what this thing is. Okay, so that's a pretty high factor for the motion blur. I'm going to leave it at 1. And that's going to give me some pretty good motion blur. It's physically accurate. It looks good, and it renders out pretty quick. Okay, so there we go. That's pretty much what there is in terms to know about motion blur and your Lagoa fluid sim. So I'm going to say I'm finished here. This example is done. Next, we're going to look at another example, and we're going to have a look at some other areas of Lagoa and how we could create some different effects, not just water fluids, but we can create other things as well.